Hello and welcome to our Lakeside Chat. We are David Wofford and Katie Noonan, co-chairs of the Rotary Nature Center Friends. And we're so happy that you can join us tonight.
As we begin our program, it is important for us to acknowledge that we are on stolen land, that Lake Merritt is part of Ohlone territory. We hear now from Corinna Gould, spokesperson for the Confederated Villages of LaShawn and co-founder of Segura Te Land Trust.
Good afternoon, relatives. My name is Corinna Gould. I am the spokesperson for the Confederated Villages of LaShawn. We are here today at what most folks think of as Lake Merritt. We are in the territory of Huichin. Huichin is actually a territory that encompasses 6 Bay Area cities: Oakland, Berkeley, Alameda, Emeryville, Albany, and Piedmont. And so this is a place that my ancestors have been since the beginning of time. And this was a place of abundance. I'm so happy that people from all walks of life that now come into our territory can enjoy this beautiful place that my ancestors have enjoyed since the beginning of time. My relationship to the land that I have been born to, raising my children and grandchildren here, has been to tell the story, the truth of what happened on this land before other people came here. I'm hoping that as we begin to learn these lessons of fires in California, the pandemic that's happening, that human beings come back to living in reciprocity with the earth.
So that's really something to think about in terms of all of the things that have caused imbalances in our ecosystem from humans throughout our history, and especially recently. We're going to hear some interesting connections there tonight. I wanted to welcome everyone. I get to welcome or see everyone as they sign in by Eventbrite, and I'm just really thrilled that people from all different areas of the country, Oakland, and from different backgrounds, people like me who don't have a huge background of understanding bees and pollination and those issues, to some academics and people, and also naturalists of all kinds who are really on the forefront of helping us understand what our connections are with all of these pollinators in our ecosystem, and how we may be affecting them, and how that might affect other species as well. So I want to give a shout out to Pollinator Posse, to Holy H2O, to the Insect Sciences Museum, and to all of the people at iNaturalist who are out documenting bees and other pollinators in our immediate area. So tonight, it gives me great pleasure to introduce our guest speaker, Dr. Hoang Vuong. During his talk, we're going to have everyone stay muted so that we'll be able to go through his talk without interruption. But please ask questions in the chat at any time during the presentation, and we'll get to them as soon as we start the Q&A section. We really encourage people to ask questions. During that Q&A, we will call upon you by noting who has raised their hand using the hand bar tool, raise hand. And then in order, we will give you a chance to ask your question and interact directly with the speaker and join the discussion. So really glad that you are here. So Dr. Vuong, I've known for a long time. He was a student at Oakland High School when I was teaching there, and he graduated in 2010. It seems like yesterday. And Hoang, I am so sorry that I was unable to get all of those great pictures I have of you at Lake Merritt, at Mount Lassen, at the dunes down in Monterey, doing GIS. Hoang was out there as a student, just taking in all of the opportunities to learn about science and science techniques, and was just a joy to have in our academy. And he was also the captain of our Sea Lion Bowl team, Ocean Sciences Bowl team, for several years. leading us to near victory, shall we say, against some very posh schools that had far more resources than we did. I was very proud of him. I could go on forever how proud I am. But anyway, so Hoang, when he graduated, he went to UCLA and majored in, you'll have to help me, Hoang, integrated biology or genetics or
cell biology.
Cell biology, good choice, because it connects with everything, as you'll see. And after that, he graduated and he went into graduate school at UC Riverside, where he developed his interest in bees and pollinators and bacteria, about which you'll hear all the juicy details tonight. So Hoang, we're very proud and happy to have you with us. Hoang graduated as a Ph.D. in 2020, I believe, and is currently working with Symbiome as a research scientist. And so, Hoang, I'm going to hand it over to you now, and welcome, and really glad you're here.
It's a wonderful pleasure. Just want to check how you're hearing me, and hopefully all of the hosts can hear me as well. Just want to get the screen share going. All right. Find my cursors. All right. All right. Well, let's get the show on the road. So welcome to my talk. My name is Hoang. We're going to learn about bees today and how to save them, what is a bee per se, and let's change your expectation and your worldview about what bees are. So I'm getting excited now. So quick forward. So my day job, and before I studied bees, I was primarily a microbiologist. So how did I get into bees and entomology in general? Well, it started with me really thinking about, what's important for our environment and what challenges do we need to overcome in the next decades to centuries. And it's really taking care of our environment and understanding how carbon capture works in our plants and how to feed a growing world population. And there's a lot of things that affect these factors in our world when it comes to plants and ourselves. So a lot of invisible things like microbes. And by the time I started grad school, by the time I got started for grad school, the human microbiome, or the collection of bacteria, fungus, and viruses on our bodies and inside our bodies, became a very hot field for me. And I saw a great opportunity in the entomology department at UC Riverside to work on bees. So believe it or not, this isn't a honeybee, but it is a bee, and not a fly, as some of my friends might joke with me. And we'll talk more about what bee this is and how can we really tell. So moving on, let's talk about the origin of bees. So this is an insect phylogeny. A phylogeny is just a fancy scientific word of calling a family tree. So this is kind of a family tree of insects. And basically they're made up of branches here. And when branches meet, they make a node. This node right here represents the common ancestor of these two branches, or beetles and moths and butterflies. So based upon fossil records and DNA evidence, researchers are able to build these family trees of different insects. The important thing also on this phylogeny or family tree is also these blue circles. So these blue circles are different evolutionary adaptations that insects have. So any blue circle here applies to every node to the right of it. So dragonflies to moths and butterflies have wings, but not silverfish, which are these creepy crawly kind of guys. And then bees, ants, and wasps are insects that have wings, folded wings, and complete metamorphosis. And just for pop culture reference, an example of complete metamorphosis is the Beedrill evolutionary line in Pokemon. So you have a larvae type Pokemon to a cocoon, and then what happens is during this cocoon phase, the larvae actually sheds its whole body. It's just actually a sack of nothingness, cells and fat and protein, and it redevelops its whole body, adult body, and begins its adult life anew. And for wasps, for bees, wasps came before them. They share a common ancestor, and bees are basically wasps that went vegetarian. So instead of spending all day looking for other insects to kill and eat, wasps decided, hey, that flower has some nice nectar and pollen. I'm gonna go have some. Because pollen is actually really rich in protein, and they actually have the enzymes, the capability to digest pollen, and our bodies don't necessarily have it, but it's actually, we begin in the last decade or so, the microbes inside bees are known to help bees digest pollen, actually. What's really cool about some bees is that they've actually reverted back to their wasp ancestors. They've saw a photo of their old crazy uncle or crazy grandfather and saw, hey, I want to eat wasps, or I want to eat other insects too. So they decided to become parasitic or carnivorous as well. In other parts of the world, there are these vulture bees. They eat rotting meat from carcasses, and they still drink nectar and make honey to an extent. From a classification level, bees and wasps are as related to each other as zebras and rhinos. Just for a brief comparison. So let's talk about what makes a bee. So what sets apart a bee from a wannabe? I've always wanted to say that. Is it the fur? Is it the wings? Is it the eyes? Is it the tongues? Like this guy right here. Believe it or not, these are both actually flies, which are a completely different group of insects. And essentially, these flies are actually still pollinators, and they're still an important part of our ecosystem. But they've evolved in a way to look like bees because they're like, hey, these birds aren't eating those bees. I'm gonna look like these bees so that we won't have to worry about getting predated as much. Right. So let's talk about physical features that you can distinguish between bees and flies. So if you notice with this wonderful photo here, you can see that their eyes, the eyes on bees, you need to see the contrast here. They're positioned more laterally compared to flies, where one, they're larger, but also they're centered towards the front. The next thing between these two photos is that you can see that the bees actually have a second pair of wings. I think it's a little bit clearer to see on this photo. You can see the start of the wing of the second pair, the two pairs of wings here. And flies only have one pair of wings. It's one pair of wings. Next, bees also can fold their wings completely over their body. Flies can fold their wings, but not to an extent as bees seen here. And finally, this is much harder to see, but if you've seen their antennae here, they have much longer and jointed antennae compared to flies, which have these really tiny ones. Also, in the group of these ants, bees, and wasps, they also have these segments that you can clearly see in this wasp right here. This isn't a bee, but because bees and wasps are so similar, it makes it harder for us to distinguish a bee from a wasp. It's more complex because they're so similar to each other. Again, they share common ancestors more recently. So there's rules, but there's many exceptions to them. The similarities begin with the eyes, the antennae, as well as the pair of wings. But one thing you can start with in terms of determining what makes a bee is the fur or the hairs, to be specific. Particularly because these bees are wasps that need to eat pollen to survive. They need to they've evolved structures to collect pollen on their bodies. Where wasps, some wasps do pollinate, but they don't have the clear and very aggressive, elaborate structures to collect pollen as bees do. And this is much harder to see, and it kind of requires picking up a bee or picking up a wasp to see, but wasps kind of have this really narrow waistline to die for. And bees tend to have a more robust body type kind of deal because they're meant to fly from flower to flower. So let's talk about this bee right here specifically. So this is a Western honeybee. So as the trivia mentioned earlier, bees are the honeybee and bee that everyone thinks about in their mind is native to Africa and Europe. Thus the name Western honeybee, going back to our earlier message about the use of beeswax in Egypt. Well, that's actually where the very first documented instance of using bees for whatever they make, whereas it's beeswax or honey. And ever since the advent of industrial agriculture and colonialism, these Western honeybees have really spread anywhere that there's a Western influence on agriculture. And here in the United States, bees aren't kept in a local area. They're actually transferred all over the country. Since if there's no flowers, there's really, in a capitalistic way view, there's no real reason to keep bees in an area where there's no crops to be pollinated. So it's kind of like the gigification of honeybees that's happened before Uber and Lyft. But how this begins during the year, during the winter, honeybees are stored in different warm areas where it's usually in the southern parts of the country. And by the time February comes around, all of the bees converge to California for all of the almonds and almond milk and all of the nice desserts that we require to make almonds or for almonds. This requires a lot of bees. The almond bloom requires a lot of bees. The more pollination occurs for plants, for these almond trees, the more almonds we'll make. And then after February, they're moved across different parts of the country. You might think that there's some like fancy way that we handle these very special and important organisms for our beekeeping, but they're just carried like everything else in this country in the back of a big rig truck. And it's much harsher for bees than say like your Amazon packages, because think of having a road trip where across the country, say from Florida to California, where you have all of your food packed in with you and you can't use the restroom and you can't throw out any of your trash that you generate from the food you packed. Hopefully they're reusable stuff, because that's really what honeybees have to deal with when they are transported across the country. They're locked in, they can't leave the hive to do bee things, as well as beehive maintenance, where different worker bees are assigned to carry out their wastes, carry out their carcasses as bees age and die inside their hives. None of that is possible when they're being transmitted. So it's kind of a wreck. This is just a very small issue with honeybees, a physical wreck, but you get the point. So let's talk about the types of bees. So again, this is another family tree. Now we focused in specifically to only look at just the different groups of bees. So the bees that most people know, like honeybees and bumblebees, they're contained in this family named Apidae. This also includes bees such as the carpenter bee, the golden California carpenter bee. And we'll talk more about why these bees are named carpenter bees later. Next, we have these like metallic green bees called agaposamon. These are sweat bees. They are mainly in the family Halictidae. And next, you have these bee lookalikes. These bees particularly are known for cutting leaves to make their nests. That's a lot of leaves to cut if you're thinking that their nests are a hive. So we'll talk more about that later. But this family is called Megachilidae. And finally, we have Callididae, where these bees are all known for making cellophane-like membranes for making their nests. And again, that's a lot of cellophane if you're thinking about these tiny little bees making a giant hive. Which isn't how it works. But of these 4 photos, these bees represent just 4 native bee species found in the California Bay Area or San Francisco Bay Area. But they're only, as we mentioned in the trivia very early on, there are only 4 of the 1,600 species that are native to California. And for those who missed, very early on, there are 4,000 native bee species in all of North America. So we're in really great company here in California. So the major difference between honeybees, bumblebees, compared to other bees, like this sweat bee right here, is this structure right here. So if you ever heard of the term the bee's knees and the bee's knees. This is what we recall. This is a pollen basket. The scientific term for that is corbiculae. This is a evolutionary feature that's only found in honeybees and bumblebees and a few other bees. And what the bees do is actually they wet the pollen as they collect it when they pick it up from a flower, and then they pack it into their legs as there's this area with increased surface area on their legs that they're used to store. Instead, for the sweat bees and many other bees, they have this hair-like structure that's specifically meant for picking up pollen. So these are called scopa, and you can see it here on the sweat bee all over. You can see in the just outside of the pixelation where you can find these scopa structures. So here's a bumblebee with it. Again, given bumblebees and honeybees are really closely related, and that's why there's so many similar features on top of the pollen basket between these 2 bees. And this is a bee that you might see very soon in your backyards if you plant any squashes, pumpkins. This is known as a squash bee, or Pepinatus pruinosa. And as you notice, there is no like condensing of the pollen and seen with the bumblebee here. What's interesting is that this bee is actually in the same family as honeybees and bumblebees, but they're not as closely related to the pollen basket bees, for lack of better words right now. So let's talk about the different life histories of bees. So this isn't talking about, say, what year this old white guy discovered them, but particularly what year, or sorry, what their lifestyles are, what their life cycle is, and where it occurs, and how they go about their lives. So as you've all grown up, your education has indoctrinated you to believe that these are how bees live in this hive with a queen and her workers surrounding her. Fun fact: these bees here are typically the very most recent adult. The young adults in the hive, they're referred to as the retinue, the queen's retinue. And beekeepers mark the queen bee because one, the beekeepers need to keep track of her in case she is lost, and also to for the one day in this dystopian way, replace her, because due to the numerous stresses that bees face, beekeepers are forced to replace queens more and more often. I think in the most extreme cases right now, I've heard 6 months, but typically it's every year. So now let's go into how the other bees live. So bees are social, as you've seen with hives and queens. That's one side of the spectrum. On the other side of the spectrum, bees can be solitary. And when bees are social, that means that there is a division of labor where there's only one reproductive female, the queen, and then the offspring that she makes immediately are her workers. Her daughters are her workers, and yeah, there's a division of labor. When a female worker bee tries to lay an egg, her sisters kind of just jump on her and remove her egg and dispose of her, because they don't take liking to treason. It's pretty graphic, sorry. On the other side of the spectrum, there's the solitary bees, which is probably the society most people want to live in and probably the society that people have lived in this past year from the pandemic. So social distancing bees, where every female are responsible for digging her own nests or finding her own nests, collecting all of the material or digging, and finding all of the pollen, laying her eggs, doing it all herself with no other help. But moving forward into that spectrum, into more social bees, there are bees where they form hives that are a little bit less than a dozen to a handful of bees. These bees are referred to as semi-social. So there is some limitation or there's some division of labor where there may be one reproductive female and other workers that did not mate. And usually there's some degree of relatedness as well, where early on in the season, the mated female bee may make a quick round of offspring to help her make the rest of her offspring the current season. And with the added amount of labor between her daughters, they can make these really long, deep tunnels underground. For a really small bee, the size of your thumbnail, and even smaller, this tunnel can be up to 1.5 meters, or I don't know the imperial distance for that, but 1.5 meters is pretty long. Try digging that yourself. And also moving forward from that is social bees, where you have bumblebees, but instead of having tens of thousands of individuals in a hive, you have dozens instead. So this is a ground nesting, this is a ground nesting bumblebee nest, where you have a queen that overwinters, that mates before it gets really cold. She finds a hole to survive for the winter, and then that's when it begins to warm up, she begins raising her brood for the following season. Whereas in honeybees, they overwinter, but there are many individuals in a hive that stay and overwinter or hibernate, not hibernate. That's the term for the other bees. That overwinter and stay in the hive with the queen and keep it warm. So let's talk about their types of habitat. You've kind of already seen it from the types of sociality, but there are ground nesting bees. So these bees can find bare, unpacked soil and dirt and make really long nests, or even with bumblebees in our urbanized environments, with our lawns and roads, they can actually find a soft spot in your lawn and make a nest. And every once in a while you might hear a story about someone mowing their lawn and being attacked by bumblebees. Well, there's a good chance that they ran over or disturbed a portion of a bumblebee hive. And underground, again, a ground nesting hive may look like this, where a single or multiple female bees have dug underground and made and laid her eggs and fed her offspring. And this is an aggregation. This is many different female bees. They don't work together, but they tend to like the same area that other bees from the same species nest. So they all dug holes together, but they all are still responsible for creating their own offspring and collecting the pollen for them. This is usually because there's a really high density of food nearby that is able to support this many female bees. Next, in our Megachilidae family, or the leafcutter bee family, we have bees that live in tubes that resemble hollow branches. And what these bees do, even though they're called leafcutter bees, there are bees that gather dirt to pack in these hollow branches to make little cells that you'll see in the next few slides and to create their nests. These bees are called mason bees, as opposed to leafcutter bees that line their nests, seen here, with leaves. And next, we have bees that live in trees. They bore holes. They evolved mandibles, and I'm really mad that I didn't get a photo of this. They evolved mandibles strong enough to cut through trees, live trees, lumber and dead wood. Typically, they like lumber and dead wood since they don't have to work as hard, which is why sometimes on your roofs or different parts of your patio and balcony, you might find like little somewhat large holes that fit these carpenter bees. And they make these divided galleries, and each of these divisions or each of these cells typically will contain a single larvae with all of the food that it needs to survive. So a typical non-honeybee lifestyle or life cycle, it's not a choice for them, but so I'll go over, this is a mason bee. So a leafcutter bee, during the start of spring or the start of summer, depending on the species, they start at different times of the year compared to honeybees that are year round. This newly emerged adult bee here spends their first 2 weeks mating. By the second week, the males had a good run. That's when the males begin to die. There's a common theme here with male bees, but between the second and fifth week, this is where the female bee really begins to do really amazing work, where they're beginning to collect all of this dirt here, or leaves, depending on what type of nest they make. And they collect this pollen mass here. So this pollen mass it's called a pollen provision. And this is all the food that's required for this larvae here it's all of the nutrition it needs for it to become an adult. The reason why all of the food is there is because once the female bee is done with this brood cell, or this combination of the pollen provision and the egg here, they close off the cell and start working on the next one. There's no further intervention by the parent or the female bee here. This is called mass provisioning. A comparison is if you've locked your child as soon as it's born in a room with 18 years of food, and by the time it turns 18, you're gone by then, because in these bees, there's no overlap of generation where every time a new generation of bees are emerging from their nest, like here, that's all the bees. That's all the bees. There's no interaction between generations. But once they're done eating all of this, or most of this pollen provision, they begin to become this grubby-like larvae and begin spinning a cocoon. This is where they have, in some bees, this is where upon finishing this cocoon-like structure, they hibernate or overwinter in this form. Other bees may begin further into development where they begin to get rid of all of their larvae internal organs and begin to transform. And some of them actually can actually fully transform in their cocoon before the winter starts, and they spend it in that form. And then the following spring or early summer, they reemerge and the circle of life continues. Yeah, in honeybees, what the difference is that they do something called progressive feeding. And essentially what that is that they just, there are worker bees that attend to the larvae every need, kind of like what newborn parents have to do with taking care of their child. Parenting is a 24-hour job. Human parenting is. So I have a quick video on what this looks like when a new generation of, in this case, a leafcutter bee, what they'll do when they'll emerge. So bees are pretty good with their timing. Typically, the last bee is actually the last egg to be laid in a nest is actually the first bee to emerge. And I can't start it, but because I got lazy and didn't click one button. But just a quick description of it, because apparently I'm good at it. Essentially, these leafcutter bees line their nests, but also cap their nests with leaves as well. So these newly emerged bees, without any guidance at all, are able to know what to do and chew through their nest without hurting their other sisters and brothers in this nest, and emerge out of this tube, as you see here, as you're beginning to see here. And then that's when a new generation of bees continue. So it's really mind-boggling to think that the fate of a species of insects, and many insects do this as well, where in the winter you've entrusted the fate of your species to just this larvae-like thing that's just a sack of fat, protein, and sugars, and that's amazing to me. Oh, it does work. I'm gonna skip. Okay. Yeah, it's a little too sunny for them. Yeah, so that's kind of the birth of a adult bee, because they kind of get two lives. One is a larvae and one is an adult. So now let's talk about sexual dimorphism. You've noticed me assuming the gender of some of the bees here, and also talking about the short life cycle of male bees. So clearly these are these aren't bees, these are ducks, but this is a clear example of what sexual dimorphism is. This is where there are key differences between male and female. within a species. In the bee world, males tend to be showy for the sake of mating, like in humans. Males tend to not live long as female bees, like in humans. Males tend to not do much beyond mating, just like humans. And you can finish the rest, but male bees also tend to be more offended by this joke, like in humans. But moving on to bees, male bees actually don't sting, but it's that's not very reassuring to many people, since in some bees it is much harder to determine whether or not a certain bee is a male or female or not. Male bees tend to be more streamlined for flight, and they have bigger bodies to like bump other male bees off of flowers, because they do get territorial, like in humans. But the most they really do in terms of like care for anything beyond mating is they guard nests or flowers. But the real hero in the bee world are the female bees, all the mothers out there. So yeah, that's really honeybees actually have it the worst in terms of males. As soon as they mate, their reproductive systems are kind of connected to their digestive system, so they kind of disintegrate as soon as they mate, and that's also an evolutionary adaptation. Not sure how that worked, how that came about, but as soon as male honeybees mate, the drones, they don't live much longer beyond that. So let's talk more about how to save them and why they're disappearing. This is a honeybee. Of course, I've talked a lot about native bees since there's amazing diversity, but in order to feed our growing world population, and we still need honeybees. And I'll share a little bit about why there as well. So why bees are disappearing? Because of a myriad of reasons, from pesticides and fungicides. These are just fancy names for them. Limited flora resources. This can also be related to habitat loss. There's no habitat without flora resources, and also suitable nesting sites, as well as parasites and pathogens. Because of global warming, because of human activity, parasites and pathogens tend to get spread around more, as well as have better survivability in warmer temperatures, usually due to global climate change. So this is just a fancy sentence and title of a science article about how the urbanization or the construction of roads, lawns, and buildings fragment bee populations. And what happens is that the more fragmented populations are, the harder it is for a population to sustain themselves, especially for those solitary and semi-solitary bees. They actually have a shorter foraging range. So the more fragmented their habitat becomes, the harder it is for them to be able to build this logistical network of nests, flora resources, if fragmentation causes your closest flora resources to be a mile away from your suitable nesting site. So just a quick graphical summary of why pollinators are declining. This doesn't just include bees, but our butterflies, as well as hummingbirds and flies. We have our loss of habitats, environmental pollution. So when we have refined oil refineries from all of our cars, do flare-ups, that actually throws up a lot of heavy metals and different gases as well. And that's also, if you can see the effects on humans, will definitely have an effect on bees as well. Pesticides, these molecules, harmful molecules, can build up in the environment. It's called biomagnification. Plants tend to suck up these pesticides and toss it into their pollen and leave it for the bees to eat it. And bees don't have a great time with it. Climate change, depending on temperature, a lot of bees actually have behaviors that are linked to temperatures. So if it's too hot, then they may not be able to mate or begin to create nests, and may do that in a later period of time, or it may prevent from doing it whatsoever at all in terms of building nests. And that's a big challenge if you're trying to produce offspring. And then finally, again, as I mentioned before, the globalization and our traveling and our trade spreads diseases and invasive pathogens and predators. And I'll have a really specific example later on. But a topic that's really dear to my heart, there's the threat of pesticides and the bee microbiome. So of course, like humans, bees also have a collection of microbes or bacteria, fungus, and viruses on their bodies that keep them healthy. So there's a lot of talk about all these bad microbes like COVID and anthrax and MRSA, and all these drug-resistant bad microbes. But at the same time, there's also really good microbes. And my work at my skincare startup is in figuring out ways to encourage the growth of good microbes. And for bees, these pesticides, such as neonicotinoids, are not great ways to improve the health of the microbiome. As I mentioned earlier, the microbiome does help bees digest pollen in a sense, just like how our microbiome, we're figuring out that the microbiome in our gut helps us digest food and changes depending on our diet to adapt to that. And pesticides tend to perturb that or disturb it to a point where it's going to affect the survival of larvae and also the long-term health of hives because of the reduction of the capabilities and health of the bacteria living inside of these bees. Something that you can do to help these bees is increase the resources available to bees, such as floral resources. There's plenty of research that says that once you either plant native plants by way of habitat restoration, you tend to find that wild bees, such as the solitary and semi-social bees that I've showed, as well as bumblebees, native bumblebees, their habitats begin to also, or their fitness or how well they're able to produce offspring improves with the help of habitat restoration and removing native species or invasive species that get in the way of native flowers from growing in an area. Also in a parallel, my research where we've looked at the transmission of microbes between flowers, a lot of the beneficial microbes are actually present in flowers. So the more flowers you have, the more availability of those beneficial microbes are. And if there are less flowers, you can kind of think of this as like a crowded bus during COVID, or a bus system during COVID. If you don't run enough buses on a bus line where a lot of people use, then what will happen is that each of those buses will be more crowded with people, and leading to more likelihood of transmission of COVID. Well, the same can happen with flowers, where if you don't have enough flowers to go around, they might still be producing enough barely enough pollen and nectar for all the bees, but there will be a greater concentration of pathogens such as fungus and mites, and other mites are basically ticks for bees, that tend to accumulate on flowers as more and more different bees and more different sick bees visit flowers. Examples, a good example of a really great bee and insect or overall pollinator flowers are these lupines. And there's a great book out there by the Xerces Society. They love bees, and they want to help them. There's 100 plants to feed the bees. They've also include also invasive, or not invasive, introduced species as well, because those can also be beneficial. And if you want to make your garden a certain way, by all means, you can choose a plant that fits your needs and also help native bees as well. And it doesn't necessarily have to be native. But there's also asters, or flowers with these, they're most known for the composite flowers, where here at this laser pointer, you can see that there are multiple tubes of pollen and multiple tubes of nectar. Well, the other notable flower that you can grow, it might be too late for this year, but for next year, you can grow sunflowers. And the reason why this is a really notable example for me, it takes up the whole screen, is because one, they're also composite flowers. They're a really rich source of pollen and nectar, but there's also special molecules based upon chemical analysis from many, many different groups of researchers that have shown that, one, increasing the density of sunflowers near croplands that require to be pollinated actually improves the pathogen resistance of bees. So something in the nectar and pollen is reducing, is making the bees more resistant to pathogens, and most likely improving their microbiome as well. So the next thing is, again, if there's no nearby place for the bees to make a nest, some of your flowers may go to vein, and you may just get a bunch of honeybees. The reason why you may get a bunch of honeybees is because, again, most solitary bees can only forage up to 300 feet from their nest. Honeybees and some bumblebees have a much greater range. Specifically honeybees, they can forage up to 6 miles away. And that's why they're so widely used in agriculture, is because of their ability to cover a lot of distance, but also their ability to be transported easily in those boxes. But as I mentioned, with all of the different habitat types, these cover all of the different habitat types that would allow bees to live in, from the wood to the dirt and hollow branches and bamboo stems. These are all great. Bees are evolved to recognize them, and if they're placed in a great spot, and they will come. There is a word of caution for some bee hotels. There's no like regulation or no standard for how they are made. So if there's a lot of gaps and openings, like here on this left side, clearly this is not an acceptable bee hotel. Or there's a lot of gaps here, from the pine cones to this random hole here to these pile of branches. This invites a lot of predatory insects, spiders, and birds. If you're trying to attract bees, you best not attract predators that will just enjoy this like shooting gallery of opportunity to get a lot of bee prey for these insects and wasps. On the right here, this is really what you want. There's not an example of how to pack in dirt for ground nesting bees, but for all the wood and branch living bees, what you want are different holes for different sizes. Bees come in a lot of different sizes. In some of those zoomed in, some of these photos, there's really zoomed in. So they may all look the same in the scope of this presentation, but they're also really small. Some can be much smaller than your pinky nail as well. And that's why you want different size holes. For these hollow branches and hollow tubes, you want them to be made out of wood or paper. The reason why is bees are really good at identifying wood. They're not going to be fooled by plastic. And also you want paper and wood because they're easy to be washed or thrown away, because after each rainy season, moisture usually attracts and allows fungus to grow. And bees aren't really great inspectors for that. So what happens is that if you don't clean it out, what happens is that this female bee's next generation will be covered in fungus, and they may or may not live, and they may spread it to other bees as well, which is not a great thing to feel. So I've talked a little bit about introduced species, and one that's somewhat overblown, but also somewhat can be a real threat in the distant future, is the Asian giant hornet. So these are wasps that are typically native to East Asia and specifically in Japan. We've predicted that they have been introduced by trade, by the import of exotic plants from Asia. And their range they've only been found in one part in the utmost north regions of Washington and Vancouver in Canada. They've only been spotted in very few hives, but the issue is just that the Western honeybees haven't evolved defenses to be able to take on this titan of a hornet. These hornets can be the size of across your hand if you have, so about like anywhere between 3 to 4 inches, I think. I think the 4-inch figure 4-inch number might be the size of a queen. So these really large armored hornets that are meant to kill bees. They rely on honeybees for their reproduction. So if they're able to penetrate the ranges of honeybees and get into where we keep our honeybees for agriculture, their populations can explode really quickly because they feed honeybee carcasses when they've raided honeybee hives to their larvae to greatly expand their numbers. However, for the wild bees and all other insects, when these hornets are on their scouting missions to find honeybee hives, they'll eat other insects to survive on their own as well. So it is a bit of a nightmare for native species as well. Fortunately, there are scientists and agriculture workers in Washington that are keeping that area in northern Washington, Vancouver area under surveillance for these wasps. Next, killer bees. The other term for killer bees are Africanized honeybees, and the reason why they're still referred to as honeybees is because they're actually the same species. Killer bees are the result of these a science experiment that gone wrong. In South America, they were trying to create a more robust and efficient honeybee. So they breeded 2 strains or 2 variations of honeybees, an Italian strain or variant and an African variant. So think of like the variants of COVID. And they weren't able to keep their hives under quarantine after they cross-breeded or combined and made hybrids of those species. And from then on, in the 80s, they've spread northward all the way up to the southernmost states. Their progress has been mostly slowed down once they've reached a certain latitude because it's just too cold for these bees in the winter. Of course, with the progress of global climate change, this has allowed some progress for these bees. But there are ways to remedy the Africanization of honeybees. They're not going to just like knock on my door tonight and and go into my room and like take care of me in my sleep or something. They're still organisms that are trying to live, and their tolerance for just outsiders and disturbances are much lower, and that's what makes them dangerous. If they set up a hive somewhere nearby humans or animals, it can be very problematic for human development. So one of the closing slides, I just wanted to show just like the richness of the diversity of bees in California and all of North America. So there are bumblebees that are native, and this bee I haven't really shown and talked much yet. They have like these really strong antennae features, or they're referred to as the great horned bees, as well as all the other bees that I mentioned, as well as this little sweat bee that's really small. Sometimes you find them on asters and dandelions, and people mistake them for gnats and fruit flies, but they're indeed bees as well. So I'd like to share some resources and talk about and give some thanks. But resources, if you want to grow some native plants, there's a wonderful resource called Cowscape. It's mainly focused, of course, around California and flowering, as well as shrubs, you name it. They're also, a lot of these native plants will be great for more than just bees, but like hummingbirds and butterflies. Other resources include Baynature, helpabee.org. This is actually run by a UC Berkeley lab. Bug Guide, Discover Life. These are all resources on identifying bees. So like a like Pokédex or for identifying bees. Yeah, so they'll help you identify bees or show you what bees can be found and where they can be found, where certain species can be found as well. Of course, special thanks to my host here tonight, as well as the lab that's housed me the last 5 years. This is my PI, Dr. McFedrick. He's awesome. These are my colleagues that are finishing grad school or have finished grad school. I'm super excited for what they have in store in their next positions. I don't think I'd be able to make this talk without them bullying me about bees, because they are way further trained entomologists than I am. But I am very proud to have worked with them, and I sure hope they're proud of me tonight. Yeah, with that said, thanks. I think we're going to open up our next portion now.
Thank you so much, Hoang. Yes. So we are at 8 o'clock, and Hoang, can you stay after to answer questions for a while?
Yeah, absolutely. I've
Okay,
gone
so
over
I'd
quite a
like
bit.
to, with your indulgence, because some people may have to leave at 8, take about 2 or 3 minutes just for a couple closing slides, and then we'll open it up to Q&A. And if we don't get to everything, I will try to send a post a document to everybody with some answers to some of the questions. I'll get together with Hoang and we'll try to get to all the great questions. I wanted to let you know that we have this is the 6th in a series, and we'll be sending you all this information. But next month, we're going to hear from Sean Van Summeren about sharks and rays in strandings that are happening in San Francisco Bay. And we had an interesting stranding event in 2017 in Oakland. So he'll be able to tell us a lot about the challenges faced by elasmobranchs, sharks, and rays in our immediate area. And after that, we were going to have a talk by Damon Tai about the fungi of Lake Merritt. Should be really great. I've heard his in-person one. It's awesome. I would like to thank our producer, Rob Lamone, and my colleagues that have been wonderful support here in getting this together. Support from the San Francisco Elks Lodge. And moving forward a bit, yes. Okay, why is this not doing it? Okay, yes. To the Frederick E. Hart Foundation for Educational Opportunity. One of our goals is to get natural history education out to everybody in Oakland, and Zoom is a great way to be able to do that. Thank you to all of these wonderful people and organizations. And I missed one. I did want to thank our volunteers and program participants with Rotary Nature Center Friends. We've been taking care of the Rotary Nature Center on the shore of Lake Merritt, and also working on a restoration site on the shore of Lake Merritt. And we've been monitoring invertebrates in various ways, and we're going to be telling you more about that in the future. But here's Betsy holding one of our settling slides that we had. Okay, moving forward. We are a citizens group advocating for the Rotary Nature Center in Lakeside Park, delivering interpretive nature and science programs. We have many partners and collaborators. We are primary stewards of the Lake Merritt Wildlife Refuge and regularly host programs of the nature shown here. And that's the end on that. So thank you for your attention with this. And now I'm going to stop my screen share. And I would like you to raise your hand to ask one of those great questions we saw in chat. And so I'm going to go to gallery view. And if your hand is raised, my helpers who've been monitoring the chat maybe can help me forward questions. I saw some wonderful questions being asked. So Kirsten and Patty, do you see some questions? I wouldn't actually, you will be unmuted at this time, I hope. Everybody will be unmuted, or you may unmute yourself and ask a question. So if you're called on, and you will be, you may ask your question in person to Hoang. Okay, so let's see. Do we see any hands up?
And just to let everybody know, if you go to your Zoom toolbar, you'll see a button that says reactions. And if you press reactions, there is an option that says raise hand.
Great. Fantastic. We have now they're popping up here. So I can,
Shantae Baker.
Let's hear from Shantae. Yes. Go ahead, unmute yourself, and if you'd like to show your video, that's fine, or if not, that's fine too.
Okay. Hi, Hoang. I put in, I actually, here I'm kind of in a dark room. I stepped on a nest at Lake Merritt and disturbed, I think, yellow jackets, and literally a swarm of, it seemed like 300 bees chased me and stung me. And I was wondering how to avoid something like that. I called vector control, and I think they ended up destroying the nest.
Yeah, well, there's only so much we can do in terms of trying to like look for nests. These insects are evolved to basically, make a nest that's sort of akin to a secret base. You don't want to be found by predators really easily. And we're kind of sort of the predators as well. In terms of the removal of the wasps, I guess one thing to add there is a lot of these yellow jackets actually aren't native to California. I think there are like eastern species in the East Coast, but some are European as well. They've just been brought over by accident with the honeybees as well. But yeah, there's only so much we can do keeping being mindful and thoughtful about the potential locations of bees and wasp nests, particularly in an area where there's less foot traffic and less disturbances between animals and people walking. That's probably where bees and wasps would love to settle. But I mean, we still want to be able to enjoy our parks as well. I think that puts me in a really hard position in terms of like what more can we do in terms of like being conscious of where bees and wasps may be.
Hoang?
Thanks.
If I could chip in, yeah, you can, if you're in Lakeside Park, you can call the Oak 311 number and report the nest. You should not try to remove it yourself if you find one by your house, but you can call in the county vector control as well. And maybe I can include that because some people like me are allergic and you don't know if you might be affected that way. It can be serious to be stung a lot of times. So, and look for bare areas in the grass where, insects are flying into a hole. That's a bad sign. Thank you. I will say no more. We have more hands, more questions. There were great ones.
Yeah, maybe some of the hosts can pick out questions in the comments from the chat as well. I saw a few great ones too, and there was a great point about the lack of microphones for some of the participants.
Okay. Let's see. I saw some really good questions.
Okay, Janice has a question.
Yes, I'd like to know, do you know anything about the connection between Lyme disease, people who, and bees, and how the bees can help survivors of Lyme disease? Did you hear of anything like that?
Oddly enough, I've learned about that from my work, my current job at a skincare company. We've connected with a woman who is a survivor of Lyme disease, who really pioneered and pushed for honeybee sting treatment for Lyme disease patients. And there's a lot we don't know about that. I believe it likely has to do with something in our immune system where we're sort of, I wouldn't call it like a vaccine of any sort, but we're kind of priming our immunity to the bee venom, and that is similar to bee or tick bites. Ticks aren't necessarily like, we're good. Bees aren't necessarily close to ticks, but when ticks bite, they release molecules that induce and cause our immune systems to act up, similarly to when bees sting us. So getting exposed and getting our immune system used to it has shown, there has been research where getting used to different exposures, getting our immune system to work is beneficial. That's really all I can add on that.
Thank you.
Interesting. I see Sue Donahue has a hand up. Can you unmute yourself, Sue?
Yes, I am now.
Thanks.
Thanks so much for your talk. I'm here in Oakland and I'm a beekeeper and I'm also a chef. And so I'm sort of obsessed with feeding things, right? And my daughter's going to Cal Poly and she's studying earth soil sciences and, concerned about agriculture and the level of CO2 and nutrition in food, right? And I'm concerned about global warming and the level of CO2 and its effect on the quality of pollen that bees are picking up. And I'm trying to perfect, right, the perfect pollen substitute to give my bees because I want them rocking,
Yeah.
So I don't know, do you have any suggestions for feeding or supplementing bees in order to keep them raising a healthy brood cycle, healthy queens, and the whole adding brewer's yeast? And I don't know what you know about feeding bees.
Not too much, but I do have some input on like what global warming can potentially cause to the pollen. I think that should give you some leads, and I'm actually excited to talk about it. So there's actually a lot of recent research on global warming, of course, but what's really interesting that is occurring with plants is that the increased carbon dioxide concentrations actually makes photosynthesis go. It increases the reactions of photosynthesis. However, there are way more different functions that plants do outside of photosynthesis, such as the collection of nutrients in the soil, such as nitrogens and minerals, micronutrients like iron and biotin, or well, that's not a mineral, but if you catch my drift there. So what happens actually is that the sugar content or the carbohydrate content that's produced from the photosynthesis actually increases in fruit and grains, based on research in other plants. So there's a good chance that the sugar content and the sugar and carbohydrate content may increase due to the increased concentrations of carbon dioxide, but that in a way, like how we can pour in water to dilute something, that in a way, in turn, can dilute the other nutrition properties of nectar and pollen. So more protein, more micronutrients, minerals, phosphorus. That's where I think about in terms of like making sure that bees are ready in a changed world where there's more carbon dioxide in the world.
Okay, thanks.
But you're most likely the pro in terms of actually feeding them and what bee patty brands there are.
I'm working on it.
Let's see, we have some other great questions in the chat. Let's see. Please raise your hand if you're still here. We'll try to get to these questions and get answers back to people later. Let's see. If there's a pollen shortage, does the bee create a smaller number of larva cells, or does it make the same number of cells but with less food and smaller adult offspring?
I think there is a degree that they make their nests, in a lack of worse, leaner, but there is a point where bees can't make as many offspring. In my observations when I was working with some of the solitary bees, when I was working with them in the later seasons where there's less flowers, there is less offspring overall. But yeah, I think that's the extent that I know of. If there's no pollen, they can't create those pollen revisions. And if they're honeybees, what tends to happen is that they have pollen bread, which is like this sort of like fermented mix that honeybees make. They store those and they slowly add to those stores, and honeybees slowly go into their pollen or bee bread storage. But they don't like their old bee bread and they don't really throw it away. They kind of keep it for a rainy day. But that's to the extent where there is like a pollen shortage. That's what I'd be thinking about, what's happening to the bees.
So please, I'm looking for hands, and I'd like to take people who want to volunteer and ask a question directly. Oh, here's one. Yes, Aaron Voorhees. Aaron, can you unmute yourself?
Hoang, I bartended for years, but I don't really drink anymore. I'm more into having tea with honey. So I was just wondering, like if I recommended a winery to go to, I would have tons. Same with like breweries. What about, is there a place to go visit where you get great honey?
Not really, or I wouldn't know. I'm not too much of a like honey purchaser. I purchase the locally sourced mountain honey that's based in Oakland, but beyond that, I am intrigued by citrus honey. What's really cool about citrus honey is, of course, in Florida and California, where we grow a lot of citrus, the citrusy zest enters the honey because those chemicals, those volatiles, enter the pollen and nectar, or enter the nectar as well, and gets into the honey. So they have this like zesty floral essence to them. But beyond that, I don't know. Like, I am a super like novice to what honey exists.
That's intriguing. Thanks. How about Ian? Would you unmute yourself and ask your question?
Yes. First, I have to confess I'm not Ian. I'm Ian's mom. But Ian is in second grade, so he probably wouldn't ask this question. But the industrialization of bees seems to place a lot of stress on them. So we attribute a lot of things to varroa mites and disease, but it seems that those things would all spread more with the hectic schedule we put bees on. How much do you attribute the problems that bees are having to that industrial treatment of them?
Yeah, I wouldn't have like a particular numbers figure, but I do think that if these bees are kind of like backlogged with their waste management and natural foraging that they have to do once they're unloaded at their destination, I imagine that these bees will be much more unfit to be able to deal with different pathogens. But yeah, with the density, the prolonged density of these bees, as during the day these bees are out and about foraging, you're going to get a greater density and a more long-term density for mites and other parasites to really take hold of these bees. And also, one last thing on that, the intensity of our monoculture as well also plays a role in also these varroa mites. Going back with that sunflower nectar research that I mentioned early on, or towards the end, if we are unable to, or if we're able to incorporate different flowers with different nectar properties, they do reduce the incidence of varroa mites as well. So the connection of industrialization of agriculture and the lack of more useful nectars with beneficial properties will be missing in our industrial agriculture practices.
And is that what's making the queens live only 6 months as well? That same, or what?
Yeah, so it's usually like a metric of overall health. What tends to happen, a barometer per se, for beekeepers to know when it's a good time to replace queens, would be whether or not the hive is making queen cells, or and as well as drone cells, because you also need to mate the queen as well. But basically, for very special things need to happen for a bee larvae to become a queen. So if you notice a hive preparing for that, then that's usually a sign that the queen is weakened to a state for whatever reason. I don't know particularly outside of like direct factors and what that does to her ability to lay eggs and manage her hive.
Thanks.
Great. I'm looking for hands up. Otherwise, I'll read a question from chat. Brian asked, he's heard of, and we've heard of, a bee die-off related to honeybees. Is this equally affecting wild bees and the bees used in commercial agriculture hives? I guess it's not just honeybees that are used in commercial agriculture. Are the other species of bees, orchard bees and bumblebees, also sometimes affected by die-off?
Managed bumblebees, I could say in in the UK, native bumblebees are, and bumblebees that are managed in the UK are facing declines as well. That's the other focus that the Europeans have. It's harder to know like the symmetry of that effect. I'd say that in the amount of attention that we've put on our managed bees, honeybees can be managed. They're kind of like, they're domesticated. They're like cattle. So you are able to restock colonies and requeen or change the queen in a way that you can't really do that with wild bees. And I say that's where I say wild bees are more affected, and they are harder to monitor as well. So I think that's the challenge with wild bee conservation. I can't really say directly what's being more affected, but yeah, I think that's the best I can answer on that.
Pretty interesting. Any other hands up? Here's another one that's really interesting. Do bees compete to control a territory? Do like hives of bees fend off other hives from their territory? And this could equally apply to solitary bees, their territorial interactions between solitary bees.
Yeah, solitary bees, they kind of like ram each other off of flowers, but not nest level competition where you have like these super organisms of hives with thousands of individuals competing against each other. And that's why beekeepers are able to put so many hives next to each other when there's enough, given that there's enough floral resources around. One thing between honeybees and, well, bees in general, if there's a high density of bees, there will be indirect competition. There's only so much pollen and nectar that flowers can pump out if there's a limited amount of floral resources. And that's since the 90s to 2000 and to now, that is a conservation concern that folks have with the conservation of wild bees and being able to continue to manage honeybees for our agriculture and our hobbies.
Great. Do we have more questions? So we have a few more minutes to ask a question, and I will receive all of the questions after this program, and I will, go through them and make sure that we can include an answer. I'll try to make a post Zoom document for everyone. Let's see. Okay, Revital, you had a question about propolis. Do you want to still ask it or not?
Yeah, I'm still here, and the question about propolis was I heard that it's the antibiotics of the bees, that it actually combats attacks from viruses, fungi, and bacteria, and they spread it all over their hive to keep the hive sterile, or practically sterile. And it's used for throat treatment as an antibiotic, as a natural antibiotic. Can you tell us about propolis?
Not too much. I know that it's a component of the beeswax, but beyond that, not really. I'm not too familiar on the typical components of propolis. What's really interesting, as you mentioned, like a lot of these bee products are, in terms of the honey to the bee bread, they are antimicrobial, as you mentioned. For honey per se, honey is antimicrobial not only because of its acidity, but also because of its lack of water. A lot of funguses and viruses don't like the lack of water. And the same with, and that's likely why propolis has those properties as well. I wouldn't say it's completely, I think one area is that there are a lot of viruses that are still around, that are still affecting bees, such as deformed wing viruses in hives that have plenty of propolis. But the extent, I'm not too familiar with it.
Thank you.
Interesting question. Here's one. Somebody has heard that bees can recognize faces. Is that true?
On a personal experience basis, not too sure. They sting me regardless. So, well, we in Riverside, we live in a very arid environment, so we have to manage. There is some intensity of beehive management where our hives tend to be more aggressive. We have a hypothesis that it's due to the heat. I don't. If they do recognize our faces, it's probably not friendly thoughts. But that's the first time I've heard of it. So there's a lot that I don't know and that I'm still like learning. Yeah.
Okay. Any last questions? And if not, we're going to end our program soon. I want to thank everyone for being here, especially, of course, Hoang for a wonderful presentation. Can we all do a final clap for Hoang and for everybody who's contributed this wonderful conversation? So if you want to just, if you want to show your pictures or just will unmute yourself so we can hear you all clapping, that'd be great. All right. Cool, cool, cool. On the count of 3. 1, 2, 3. Yay! Hoang, I'm so proud of you. That was amazing. Really enjoyed it. We have a hand up from Anthony. Oh, he's doing a graphic clap. That's great. Thank you. Thank you so much, everyone. And if you have, you can always email me with a last minute question, or like I said, I will try to pull out all the questions and get answers to everybody. And someone asked for a list of resources and the papers cited. And again, we'll try to get that to everybody after this Zoom.
Get going with that too.
Well, thank you so much.
Yeah.
So proud of you, Hoang. That was great. I wish you all the success in your research and in your future career. You're a good communicator, and it just was a wonderful night. Thank you all so much.